before we get into our other areas, I'd like for you to explain to our audience how you look at the questions of how you see life and how you live your life, because I do think those are two separate but very important concepts in the book that you say over and over again. And I had to keep reading it to understand what they meant. And so for our readers, the questions aren't just being asked on a scale of 1 to 10, but there's a difference between how you see things and how you live them. And can you talk more about that and why?
Absolutely. That's a fantastic question, because measuring how someone's well-being is as complicated and nuanced as understanding whether or not an economy is growing or contracting. Of course, when we think of GDP, there are multiple components on government spending. How big is the consumer-based economy? And similarly, when we're looking at people's lives, we have to measure different components. So the way that we do this is we start with a definition, and we define subjective well-being as how someone sees their life and how someone lives their life. Now, this is two very different constructs, and much of it is rooted in Nobel laureate Daniel Kahneman's work, who is, of course, known as the father of behavioral economics, because how you remember life is very different than how you experience life. And so we're trying to capture both concepts. So the way that we get at how you see your life is we ask people to rate their lives on a scale of 0 to 10, where 10 is the best possible life and 0 is the worst possible life. Where do you stand today? Now, when we rank those countries, the countries who rate their lives the highest are often the richest. That's why when you hear the world's happiest countries, the use of the word happy may be a misnomer, because what you're probably looking at is the countries where people are the most content. And it's why places like Denmark, Finland, and Sweden are often number 1 on that list. And the countries at the bottom are places like Haiti, Democratic Republic of Congo, and Afghanistan. They rate their lives the absolute worst in the world. Now, on the other side of the ledger is how people experience life. That's whether or not they have a lot of stress every day, whether or not they have a lot of sadness. It's also whether or not they laugh and smile a lot, or whether or not they have a great deal of intellectual stimulation, which we've attempted to capture through asking people whether or not they learned or did something interesting the day before the interview. And when we look at the results of that, they're very different than how people see their lives. So the part of the world that experiences the most negative emotions, it's been true every single year in the 15 to 16 years that we've been tracking this, which is the Middle East. Iran and Iraq have almost always been number 1 and number 2 on that particular list. And on the other side of that ledger, which is positive emotions, whether or not people laugh and smile a lot, experience a lot of enjoyment, whether or not they feel well rested or treated with respect, the region of the world that dominates that, which has been true for 16 straight years, is Latin America. You could argue that no one in the world knows how to have more fun than Latin Americans. So that's what the measurements look like and why they're different. So when people approach us and they go, I need a definitive list on who the happiest people in the world are, our question is always back to them, well, that depends on how you define happiness. Because if you define it through contentment, then yes, indeed, Danes, Finns, and Swedes are the happiest people in the world. But as you noticed in the book, when that gets launched, it's Gallup's data that are used in the World Happiness Report. It's very confusing to many people in those countries. In fact, one official actually said after the results, somebody said, what's it like to be a minister in the government of the country that's happiest in the world? And he said, if we're the happiest country in the world, I'd hate to see the other countries. And the joke's funny because it's true. They don't see themselves as happy, but I don't think any of them would argue the fact that they're very content. So again, if you define happiness as contentment, then it's the Nordic countries. But if you define happiness as experiences of joy and laughter, then it is without question Latin America where people are the happiest.
That just reminds me of an anecdote that a Finn once told me about how in Finland they think Russians are too happy. That compared to Finn, you're thinking exact, and I think that really hits at this point of contentment versus experience of positive emotions and the like. And that also then has policy implications, I think, because you do have you've seen it in a number of U.S. circles of we should we should be more like the Scandinavians, whether it's in education policy or in employment policy, because this will make us happier, or it will make citizens happier. But I think this is a great point to throw out, that contentment versus happiness is defined as continuous experience of positive emotions, laughter, and joy are separate things, and that may lead to very different policy outcomes and recommendations.